If the public thinks that a particular course is the wrong course, then they would love the government to be knocked off it. Tonight, I think what we really need to talk about is the politics of Treasury U-turns. And meanwhile, if this has been a strong day for the Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Badenoch, in the Chamber, then it's not been a great day for her in the opinion polls. The latest has Reform at its highest ever at 29 points, Labour down to 22, and the Tories just 1 point ahead of the Lib Dems at 17. That's the Conservatives' worst showing since the Brexit mayhem. I suppose, therefore, the ideal guest tonight would be somebody who can explain the pros and cons of chancellors ditching unpopular policies and can also give some candid and friendly advice to the Tory leader. Luckily, I have that guest. A little earlier today, the former Chancellor George Osborne was in the back of my cab. We discussed the winter fuel allowance cut. I wanted to get his candid advice on what the Chancellor Rachel Reeves should do now.
The kind of thing about the winter fuel payment cut that she's made is it doesn't actually save very much money. And it was basically the first thing the government did, and therefore a lot of people noticed, and it came without any explanation. And so if I were her, I would sort of, rather than just dig in, I would kind of find a new, introduce a new kind of payment for winter time, and
yes.
and then so you sort of change the terms of the debate.
A new threshold, or tax it, or something.
Just sometimes you just need to sort of muddy the water and create some new form of allowance, and so you're no longer, you're not comparing apples with apples. I think it's important. It's also a hard calculation for any prime minister to make, which is when do you kind of dig in, show you're not for turning, be the Mrs. T, or when do you realise that it's, you're digging yourself further into that hole I was talking about. And I think on this, it's not really serving any wider purpose. It's not part of some great...
So your candid advice would be chuck it.
Well, I defer a bit to my podcast partner, Ed Balls. You very kindly came on Political Currency the other day. And Ed, who's obviously steeped in Labour and steeped in the sort of Labour Treasury thinking, he right from the word go said this is a really big mistake, and he has been saying get rid of it. Personally, I wouldn't just get rid of it. I might find a reform that makes the problem go away.
Whether it's reform or abolition, do you think it's inevitable now, given the unpopularity of this measure, that it's going to go?
No, I don't think it's inevitable, precisely because I don't think there's any risk of losing it in Parliament. This is a decision for Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves. I mean, I am told that when this was first discussed in number 10 Downing Street, in other words, when the Chancellor came to the Prime Minister and said, this is what I'm planning to do, this wasn't even in the first budget. This was a kind of early statement from the government. The Prime Minister didn't raise any questions about it. So I think he's probably thinking, a bit culpable that he didn't challenge the Chancellor, because there is a job of the Prime Minister to, I always felt as Chancellor, to make sure that the Chancellor is doing things that are politically sellable for the whole government. And I think they'll be tempted to just say, look, it'll blow over. There are lots of other reasons, Labour are struggling. Winter's a long time away. But I don't know. I wouldn't want to kind of get to next winter and still be having a row.
What about amour propre? The extent to which it's just embarrassing. It's even a little bit humiliating for a Chancellor to change their mind in public.
Well, politics is full of embarrassment and humiliation. You just have to be careful about, not having too much of it. I think from a Chancellor's point of view, obviously, the job comes with a requirement to be solid and immovable. But at the same time, it's a very, I mean this not in a kind of bad way, it's a very political role. The thing you're dealing with is money and how much taxes you raise and how much you spend. And you've got to be a political chancellor as well as, a chancellor with a big vision of the future of the country. And you've got to help carry your government. And I don't know, it feels to me that I guess I was somewhat surprised that we've got through winter. This payment was paid only to half of pensioners some months ago, and yet it featured a lot. It clearly did feature a lot in the local elections. Now, whether that's a kind of symbol of things that have gone wrong for the Labour government, or, that people don't really understand.
It's certainly stuck in people's mind,
So whether it's a specific measure, I think it's stuck in people's mind, Andrew, because it was the first thing you heard from this new government. They got elected with a massive majority. And then what was really the first big announcement? After a few weeks, they cut the winter fuel payment. They actually scrapped some road schemes at the same time. And then you had the row about, Taylor Swift tickets and kind of problems in number 10 with the chief of staff. And that was the initial impression of that Labour of last year. And that's a big problem. I think they've been struggling ever since. And you compare it to the Blair-Brown first, 100 days, if you want to use a kind of Americanism, with the independence of the Bank of England. Compare it to the Cameron-Clegg coalition government and the Rose Garden. People lampoon it a bit now, but it had a kind of confidence and a sense of a plan to it. And I think they're still paying a price for a poor start. Personally, I'm not as partisan as I obviously used to be. I think Keir Starmer's doing quite a good job on the international stage, and I think he's doing actually quite a good job at handling Trump, which is one of the kind of big tests of being a leader of a country at the moment. So there are lots of things that are actually going quite well, and I think the Indian trade deal
I was going to ask you about that.
Is a good achievement.
Because Nigel Farage says it's scandalous beyond belief and undercuts British workers.
But, I don't want to relitigate Brexit, but the Brexiteers pulled us out of our big trade deal, which was the single market and the customs union with the European Union. And then they promised us all sorts of other trade deals, most of which have not materialised. Where's the American one? I remember Barack Obama warning we'd be at the back of the line, and sure enough, back of the queue. Sure enough, we appear to have been. And then when it comes to this Indian trade deal, there were a succession of Tory prime ministers who tried to land this and didn't. And in the end, to secure a trade deal, if you're negotiating by yourself, if you're not part of a big bloc, you have to make some compromises. And it feels to me quite a small compromise that for a couple of years, Indian workers here who are paying an equivalent to national insurance to the Indian government don't pay national insurance here. I think, what probably the government should have done is explain better that this thing was coming, because it sort of landed out of the blue, this Indian trade deal. And so the ground wasn't particularly well laid. I don't think it's been explained that it's a kind of form of double taxation agreement, which is a kind of complicated way of saying kind of things we agree with other countries. And of course, I don't think it's been helped at all by the hostilities between India and Pakistan coming just hours later. So that's kind of confused everything. But fundamentally, it's a good thing for the UK. And I think in a world where, our kind of traditional ally, the United States, is making life pretty difficult for us with tariffs, I think to show that other countries like India are prepared to strike deals with us is a good thing.
A good mitigation for Trump.
Yeah, it doesn't, unfortunately, completely compensate, but it's hard. I tried to do various things with the Indian government and the Indian parliament, and being a massive, messy democracy, it's quite hard to land things with the Indian state. And so I think they've done a pretty good job from what I can see.
How worried are you at the moment about the effect of Trump on the economy?
Well, I'd say I'm more worried about the effect of Trump on our security. And of course, security underpins our economy. The economic impact has been bad because it's created uncertainty. I think if you're a company, or where are you going to invest? Are you going to build a new factory? You don't know how much you're going to be able to sell these things for to big markets like the US. And even if he kind of rose back on some of the tariffs, as the government here are trying to get him to do, I think quite a lot of the damage has been done just by the uncertainty. And the tariffs are like a form of tax. They make things more expensive. But what worries me is more, the fact that people begin to doubt whether the Americans would be there, if Europe was attacked, if NATO really was attacked. The NATO promise, has always, I guess, ultimately depended on a decision of the American president. Whatever treaty you sign and whatever annual meeting you have, ultimately the American president's always going to be the person who decides whether to send American troops to the rescue. But I guess Trump has kind of called that out and put that in doubt. And that, for my mind, makes life much more dangerous. Certainly, it takes us back to a world I grew up in, but kind of ended when I was at university, which was, a world where we were, of course, very nervous about what was happening in what was then the Soviet Union or behind the Iron Curtain, now in Russia. And certainly, we're about to celebrate VE Day. Our involvement in the Second World War started with the invasion of Poland. So the idea that these things
are far away, they're not.
We are constantly reminded they're not.
We were talking a moment ago about Nigel Farage. There's a poll from YouGov this morning which puts reform on 29 points, which is their highest number yet.
Yeah.
And the Conservatives, I have to say, at 17 points, just 1 point ahead of the Lib Dems. That's quite close to levels at which, if it was in an election, you'd be almost extinct as a party.
Well, I feel I'm kind of earning veteran status, having been around politics for a long time, coming here into Millbank. I think I first came in here 30 years ago. And I've heard several times that there'll never be another Conservative government, and I heard several times there'll never be another Labour government. Both things true not to be the case. So I'm not someone who believes all the kind of hype that we've seen the end of the two-party system. And I think it is exceptionally difficult for a Conservative opposition just recently ejected from government to come back. I think the only example I can think of the one-term government in my lifetime was the Ted Heath government at the very beginning of my very beginning of my life. So it is, the task facing Kemi Badenoch and the shadow cabinet is historically huge, even though this Labour government are not haven't made such a strong start. And so I have some sympathy with the position they're in. I don't personally think chasing Nigel Farage's tail is going to work. And if you want Nigel Farage, why not have Nigel Farage? I think the kind of 10-year trend inside the Conservative movement of trying to copy the Brexit Party or the UKIP Party or now the Reform Party has not really worked.
It certainly hasn't. One of your successors, Jeremy Hunt, Conservative Chancellor, said that he thinks the extinction of the Conservatives can't be ruled out.
Yeah, I mean, look, I find it hard to believe that we've just had 14 years of a Conservative governments. Conservative Party has governed our country for about 3/4 of the last 200 years. I mean, I think it's unlikely it's about to disappear. I think the big kind of question is, does it strike some kind of deal with reform? And the deal with reform, let's be honest, is not going to be the personnel in reform other than Farage, because they don't, it's a bit of a one-man band. I know, of course, lots of reform councillors have been elected, and, my friend Andrea Jenkins has just become the mayor of Greater Lincolnshire. But fundamentally, the appeal there is built around Nigel Farage. And so that, it's more of a question of whether the Conservative movement finds a way to adopt him. And, of course, the price he'll extract is to be the Prime Minister or the Prime Ministerial candidate. And that will be a big temptation to a lot of Conservatives. Personally, I would... there's a big space at the moment in British politics for someone who's got a plan to grow the British economy, which strikes me as the main concern for most of the public. So if we spoke a little bit less about transgender toilets and a bit more about taxes, then we might be on to something. We might be on to, no Conservative opposition in my lifetime has got back without winning back credibility on the economy and making that the central offer at the election.
Is that the fundamental mistake that the Conservative leadership is making at the moment? In other words, following the culture war and not being a mainstream, education, health, taxation, economy opposition?
Well, I think it's certainly the case that Kemi Badenoch, made a reputation for herself and speaks very effectively and with passion on kind of cultural issues, cultural war issues, transgender rights and the like. But it's not. That's what helps you be the rising star. I don't think it sustains you as a risen star. I think to be the leader of the opposition, you have to be someone who offers the country a credible economic plan. And there is a bit of a gap in the market. No one at the moment has got a plan that certainly has convinced the public is going to grow the British economy. And, I mean, you could argue for the Conservative Party. I mean, we are celebrating, if that's the right way to put it, the 10th anniversary of the 2015 election today, and the 10th anniversary of the end of the coalition government, which I was part of. And, of course, then there was a majority Conservative government under David Cameron for a short period until the referendum. But, it's not been since the coalition government that the country has had that long-term economic plan that it has confidence in, that commanded public support.
That's what you need.
And I don't think the opposition is offering it, but the good news for the opposition is there's a gap in the market for it.
This is a safe space of truth and candour and straight talking. Do you think
truth and reconciliation, I think, is what Prince Harry calls it.
Not necessarily reconciliation. Do you think Kemi Badenoch will be leader of the Conservative Party at the next election?
I think she's got a better chance than anyone else, not least because she's in the post. And I don't think anyone really thinks that switching leader is the solution to the problem.
Second candid question. Could you vote for a Conservative alliance or group where Nigel Farage was the prime ministerial candidate? You personally.
That is a good question. I would have quite a lot of reservations because I think.
So you're verging on no.
I'm verging on no, but I certainly would not vote for reform. And I mean, my politics is on the centre right, but the centre bit is as important as the right.